In this presentation, I would like to take a look at the rather delicate procedure for removing the stamped valve cover on your Honda GC series engine. So before we get started, it's important to note that Honda manufactures two different types of valve cover. One looks like a cast sort of piece, and it's found on the more industrial versions. It also includes a valve cover gasket. And then there's the consumer grade version, which is what we are taking a look at, that is held on with RTV, which stands for room temperature vulcanizing silicone, and it is made out of a much flimsier metal. So if you're a little bit ham-fisted with your tools, you might consider just purchasing a new valve cover and of course the sealant to go along with it. So I kind of have a method that I use with a putty knife and a hammer that works fairly well for removing the valve cover at least a couple, 3 or 4 times before we have to replace it. So before we get into this lab, let's take a look at the expectations. Your job is going to be to remove the 4 bolts from the valve cover, and then you will bring your engine up to my table where I will go ahead and remove that valve cover. You need, after that, to complete what's called the scrape and peel activity. And there's 2 parts to this. One is going to be the valve cover and the associated surface on the jug or the engine block. It's kind of a uniblock design, as we've talked about. And then there is another part to it, which is the sump cover and the associated area of the engine block. So we'll remove the sump cover after we remove the valve cover. Let's go ahead and take a look at this engine. So first things first, we'll remove these 4 bolts, lefty-loosey. What we're going to do next, obviously we need to ensure all the oil is drained out of the engine. And since I'm doing this in the studio here, I'm simply going to put a shirt underneath the front of this engine to help tip the block back a little bit, such that any oil kind of goes to the back of the engine. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to bend the top of the valve cover just a tiny little bit, not so much that you can't straighten it out, but enough that you can get a putty knife behind it. I just use an old putty knife, and I start about halfway through the bolt hole. In other words, I'm only using about half of the putty knife. The reason is if I go the full length, I'm going to hit the valves. If I go down too far, I'm going to hit the camshaft. So I'm just going to go about halfway through where that bolt hole is in the front. That's about the depth that we go. Some gentle taps. I can put a twist on the valve cover as well, or excuse me, on the putty knife to kind of help keep that from cutting into the side. And you can see we broke the RTV. We're going to stop about there so that we don't hit the camshaft that is here. We don't want to crack it. We're going to repeat the exact same thing on the other side, and then we'll go across the top. In fact, we might just go across the top here first. Again, about halfway down. It's a little bit hard to hold and get filmed at the same time, but we're getting it done. Okay, so there's the top, and then we're going to do the same halfway down. You can kind of see that through the bolt hole. And there we are. So again, we're just going to make sure that the front of the engine is elevated. Get rid of that. And we should be able to pull this valve cover completely off. So here's the RTV that we need to clean off, this Honda Bond. It's going to be a little bit of a challenge. I'm going to go ahead and clean this, but we're going to replace this valve cover because of the big dent in it. To remove the Honda Bond, I'm simply going to take a single edge razor blade, and I'm going to scrape as much of this stuff off as I possibly can. I'm going to try to avoid getting it inside of the engine. It's a little bit of a tedious task, not really the end of the world. If you can get about, I'd say 95% of it removed, especially out of these bolt holes and things like that, it makes my life a lot easier when I come by with a wire wheel. So between a Scotch-Brite and one of these single edge razor blades, you should be able to get the vast majority of this Honda bond removed from your engine. The same procedure is going to work for your valve cover. If you're doing this with a live engine for a customer, you really want to be careful not to get any of this trash knocked inside the engine. You might consider putting a rag or something up here into this area. But for this particular example, it's not going to be that big of a deal because we're going to take the entire engine apart and clean it anyway. So sometimes just scraping down, look at that, really doesn't take a terribly, crazy amount of time as far as that's concerned. We'll touch this up with a Scotch-Brite and we'll repeat the exact same procedure on the valve cover. For demonstration purposes, this is about how clean I would like to have your engine before we hit it with a wire wheel. We'll also use a little bit of degreaser on it prior to the reassembly phase. I didn't have to take anything out. We didn't knock too much stuff inside the engine, so should be ready to proceed with the sump cover removal at this time. This has been a look at how to remove the valve cover from your Honda GC Series engine.